Greetings and almost happy Tu B'Shvat. Tonight we'll be talking about Kilayim as part of the series of the Mitzvot of the land in the state of Israel. Last week we talked about Orla, and Tu B'Shvat actually, as we know now, is intimately connected to Orla. One thing that I neglected to mention, I want to bring out now, is that it's a case where there's a machloket, a discrepancy between, a controversy between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says that the Orla clock stops at Rosh Chodesh Shvat, at the beginning of Shvat, whereas Beit Hillel says that it stops at the 15th of Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, and that is the halacha. But it is a rare case where Beit Shammai will permit fruit that Beit Hillel will not permit fruit. So mark it down, Beit Shammai is actually mekil in this case. And now on to Kilayim. What are Kilayim? Kilayim means things that are mixed together. And the pasuk says, observe my decrees. Don't crossbreed different kinds of animals. Don't plant your field with mixed seeds. Don't wear clothing woven of two kinds of materials. That is called shatnez, but it says specifically that it is linen and wool. Any other mixture, as we'll discuss shortly, is not shatnez, does not qualify. You can wear any other mixture that you want. So there are four kinds of kilayim, as mentioned in the pasuk. There's kilayim of vineyards, in which planting and pruning vineyards that are mixed, we'll discuss what that means, and even benefiting from such vineyards is prohibited. So much so that actually you are given a choice in the Torah to either pull out the thing that was interspecies planted against halacha, or you can pull out the vineyard. Most people pull out the secondary species. There's kilayim of seeds, of annual crops. Planting and pruning or dealing with it is forbidden, but the vegetables themselves, the grain, is permissible for consumption. Kilayim of garments, interspecies weaving of linen and wool, those are the only two species that are prohibited to mix, permitted for any use except for wearing them. You can make it, you can sell it, you can use it as a blanket on an animal between you and an animal. Question of wrapping yourself in a blanket? No, you can't do that. Kilayim of animals, interspecies breeding of different kinds of animals. It's permitted for breeding and raising, and they're forbidden only for mating. Now, what does that mean? Breeding means also developing them. It doesn't necessarily mean the actual sexual congress. Kilayim of animals, yoking them together with each other, is forbidden for plowing and drawing, and for driving, that is to say, to pulling agricultural implements. A different pasuk says, don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now, it was really, really hard to find a picture of an ox and a donkey together. This is the only one that I found. There are plenty of drawings, but even among the more primitive agricultural societies, such a thing is really vanishing from the landscape. However, there are interspecies breedings of animals. A geep is a cross between a goat and a sheep, and it does happen. A liger is a cross between a tiger and a lion. There's also a tayon, and it depends which one is the male and which one is the female. But it makes for a large and very weak animal. I've actually seen one of these in a zoo in Canberra, Australia. And it's like 3 meters long, and it just lies there, which is good, because if it got up and chased you, you'd be scared. And this is not the recommended way of doing genetic engineering. Photoshop is a confusion and a source of halachic uncertainty for some people. This crossbreed between a horse and a zebra exists. There are movies of it available online showing it running around, and this is the animal, and it really does look like that. Down below, however, the one on the right is, for all that you would love to have such a menorah on your pet zebra, that's Photoshop at its worst. Mules and any other crossbred animal are permitted for use. You just can't introduce the mother and the father together. No such thing as a horse and donkey date. And they were used by not just the IDF, but by many armies. They're very strong animals, they're intelligent animals. They're stubborn animals. Stubborn as a mule is based in fact. Shatnez, only linen and wool woven together. Woven together. If you have a wool blanket and a linen sheet, you can mix them together like this, one on top of the other. That's fine. That's not shatnez. If you have the plants, a linen plant, a flax plant, to get next to a clump of wool, that is not a problem. And therefore, the only thing you cannot do is wear them when they are woven together. Now, on the left, you see a piece of suiting, a 40 regular, for those of you who are interested, which is close to a 50-50 mix of wool and linen. And even though it's been marked down substantially, it is still asur to wear it. You can buy it. You could actually give it to somebody for whom it's not asur, but don't be tempted just by the price. On the right-hand side, you see linen and wool woven together, a very pleasing kind of fabric. Made into a cushion, it's perfectly fine to lean against that cushion. If you are concerned about kilayim, of shatnez, then there are a number of laboratories, and there is such a thing as the International Association of Professional Shatnez Labs, the IAPSL, as it's known, where they have microscopes and matches. The microscopes are to see the curly hairs of the animal fiber, and the matches are to burn a sample and to see if it burns the way a plant fiber would burn. Those are the only two tools you really need. Kilayim of seeds. In the Mishnah in Kilayim, it says that wheat and wheatgrass are not mixed species if sown together. Barley and oats, spelt and rye, each one is a pairing. Full beans, so wheat and wheatgrass, barley and oats, spelt and rye, and then comes a cluster. Full beans and mung beans, jilaban, as the Bartanura translates it, lupins, white beans, and lubia are not considered kilayim with each other. So those are 4 sets of plants that can be sown together and are not considered kilayim with each other. Now, if we're mentioning grains, I just want to put out that 5 grains must have challah taken from them. And since kusmin is mentioned both in Kilayim and in Masechet Challah, let's have a side excursion to kusmin for a second. So we have wheat, barley, spelt, which is kusmin. Most of the kusmin bread that you buy here in Israel is made from spelt grown in Canada, Canada, oats, and rye. Spelt is kusmin. And it looks like a grain. It looks sort of like wheat or barley because it's related to those. Kusemet is buckwheat or kasha. It's the Polish soul food. It is not one of the 5 species. So where you see that it says kusemet, lechem kusemet, or kusemet, is not chametz, and it's not one of the 5 grains either. Back to our topic. Why not intercrop and cross-graft species? Why shouldn't we consider strengthening things? Cross-species hybriding. Hybrids are generally considered to be strong, longer lasting. Sefer HaChinuch, and we do not know who the author of Sefer HaChinuch was. He deliberately wrote it anonymously, but it's been published in print ever since, once they invented the printing press in the 15th century. The Holy One, blessed be He, created His world with wisdom, understanding, perfection, and He made it perfectly fine. Who are we to interfere in the holy, perfect creation of God? So it's forbidden to do that by intercropping and cross-grafting and cross-hybridizing species, says the Sefer HaChinuch. Ramban takes it even further. He says that the Lord created species in the world and endowed them with the power of reproduction so that the species may continue perpetually for as long as He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, desires the world to exist. That's it. They should never change, because it says in Breshit, Leminam, Leminehem, after their kind. Combining 2 different species, trying to make something new, negates the concept that the world is created by God, and how He created it is the way we should maintain it. So, says Ramban, Kilayim, the mitzvah of Kilayim, observing Kilayim means not doing Kilayim. It's a rather strange way of looking at it, but that is the way the mitzvah is set up. He says things that are no longer true, says Ramban. Species in living beings cannot give birth to a kind that is not their own. These days, you can do all kinds of transplants into the womb of a foreign, so to speak, species and still get something to be born. Even if the hybrids were born from them, they are such as mules, they are sterile, that is true. Occasionally, a fertile mule shows up, but for the vast majority, cross-species animals are indeed sterile. That's not always the case with plants, despite what the Ramban says. So this, he says, is lo sizra sadchat kilayim. You can't sow your field with mixed seed because you're negating the work of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God's creation. Now, how far apart should we therefore plant things? What are our limits? Well, this is brought down in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, and the two foremost interpreters of the spacings brought down in our Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the Oral Law, were Rav Avraham Yeshayahu Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, and Rab Chaim Na'eh, Avraham Chaim Na'eh, known as the Grach Na'eh, Hagaon Rab Avraham Chaim, that's the first part, Na'eh. His famous sefer, the Chazon Ish, was known as Chazon Ish because his initials of Avraham Yeshayahu was Aleph Yud Shin, so it's Ish, and the Chazon was his interpretation of the law. So the Sefer Chazon Ish is known. The Noda B'Shi'urim of the Grach Na'eh is less known, but it is equally accepted, especially by people who want to be a little bit makil. How is that the case? The halachic measurements are based on physical measurements. So a finger width is the basic measurement of length. And if you do it in 2 directions, you get area. If you do it in 3 directions, you get volume. So let's start. The etzba, according to the Chazon Ish, is 2.4 centimeters. The Grach Na'eh says that it's 2 centimeters. The hand's breadth, a tefach, 4 fingers, is almost 10 centimeters according to the Chazon Ish, and 8 centimeters according to the Grach Na'eh. A cubit, an amah, is 6 tvachim. I don't have enough hands to show you, but here is 1/3 of a cubit. The Chazon Ish says it's 58 centimeters. The Grach Na'eh says it's a little bit less than 50. So the Grach Na'eh overall gives you about a 17% discount on your distances, which means you can put things closer together, and there are many other implications for his generally smaller and therefore, in this case, more lenient depiction of the halachic measurements. Says the Rambam, there are species among seeds where one type will diverge into many forms. Absolutely. There's all kinds of interspecies variations or within species, intraspecies variation. As an example, in the family known in Latin as the Solanaceae, we have eggplants and peppers and tomatoes. And I think that most of us can distinguish one from the other, but their seeds look very, very similar because there is a biological similarity among them. Says the Rambam, even though they don't resemble one another, since they're one type, they're not considered mixed species. Now, as it happens that the eggplant, the pepper, and the tomato will be considered kilayim with each other, but the different varieties of eggplant, the different colors of tomato, the different shapes of pepper can be planted each next to each other. We do not worry about kilayim within the species. Thus, eggplant, pepper, tomato, and a fistful of differently colored, differently sized, differently flavored tomatoes, they are halachically all one kind of vegetable. On your upper left-hand corner, you see potato fruit. That's right, potato fruit. A potato is a plant, and we eat its tubers. We don't eat its fruit because they are poisonous. In fact, up until the 1700s, even the 1800s, tomatoes were considered poisonous also, as was tobacco, which is also related to tomatoes and potatoes and peppers and eggplants. However, there are some people who have tried to, you take the potato seed and you grow it, and you have a potato plant, and on that you graft a tomato plant. As we see here in the bottom right-hand corner, grafting of tomatoes to improve resistance to salinity. Now, despite the title, if you look at the grafts themselves, I'm not going to bring you all the scientific details, actually they didn't find that it promoted salinity tolerance. So, they were over on Kilayim and they were under on salinity tolerance. However, commercially, there are good reasons to do Kilayim. Halachically, not such good reasons. We'll talk about that shortly. And here's a Kilayim machine. What do I mean by a Kilayim machine? A Kilayim machine is one that takes one flat of vegetables on one side, one flat of vegetables on the other. One side is going to provide the top, called the scion. One of them is going to provide the bottom, called the rootstock. And then they're going to be grafted together. Now, it can be something like a glorified clothespin, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner, or there can be various different kinds of clips. But these do it automatically, and I have seen these machines in action. We have some in Israel also, and they turn out grafted plants at an astonishing rate. But is this grafting halachically permissible? Why do we want to do the grafting anyway? Well, there's a very good reason. This is up near Haifa. This is in Israel. There are diseases that are basically wiping out a lot of the melons. A lot of them. The watermelon, the cantaloupe, the Galia melon, all the nice fruits of summer, or of the Arava in the winter. Fusarium is a fungus that attacks the roots of these melon species. And Menachem Edelstein at the Neve Yaar outpost of the Ministry of Agriculture's Research Center studied for a long time how you could graft melons onto something else. And at the end, he was actually working on a different kind of melon as opposed to what he started out with, which was pumpkin, squash, Hubbard squash. But why? Well, if you see on the left-hand side, on the grafted plants, they're surviving this infected field, and they will produce their melons shortly. The right-hand side, the ungrafted ones, the plants died very quickly, and the watermelons are very small and not commercially viable. So this is a reason for getting into grafting of melons. Interspecies mixing as opposed to the grafting, planting something side by side. So we have three, I hope interesting, elements here. On the right-hand side, you have Kilayim, illustrations that are found in almost all, even the handwritten copies of the Mishnah that have come down to us. There are illustrations of different ways of setting up your field and different diamonds and squares and what goes in the center and what goes on the side, what goes in the corners. All of these are dealt with in Chapter 5 of Mishnah Kilayim, and how you can use these spacings to avoid interspecies planting, interspecies sowing of mixed crops, to avoid the isur, for the prohibition of Kilayim. On the right-hand side, we see the Perush to Seder Zra'im, the first Seder of the Mishnayot, by Chaim Nachman Bialik. Yes, that is Chaim Nachman Bialik himself, and he was a student in the Volozhin Yeshiva until he left it at the age of 18 or so. And there was a competition to provide a perush, to provide anything. If you wrote a good sefer, then the prize for this competition was that they would publish it. There are so many novellae that are written by all kinds of earnest yeshiva students that never see the light of day. Chaim Nachman Bialik's perush won first prize, and his perush was published. Later, when he came to what was then Eretz Yisrael, or Palestine, if you will, then he decided, since he was at heart, not in action necessarily, but at heart, a traditional person, he said that the students in the Tel Aviv school system should learn the basics of the Mishnayot, the backbone, the legal backbone of the Jewish people. And he caused his Mishnah to be published with an introduction to each one of the, he only wrote, by the way, on Seder Zra'im, but each one of the Mishnayot, so it would be on Brachot, on Kilayim, on Orla, on Revai, all of those have his Perush, which he draws from only the traditional sources. So just you should know that there's poetry even in the Mishnah, or the Mishnah in the poetry. At the bottom there's a ruler, it says Sadcha lo tizra kilayim, that is the pasuk, do not interspecies sow your field. There's a group called the Shomra, which has a Kilayim ruler. Up. So the Kilayim ruler does not show up yet on this Matzeget, sorry. But you see the large 15, so from 1 to 15 centimeters is where we have to have a separation, and we'll see that shortly. Commercially, there really are interspecies mixings. This is an Al-Shobak Jordan, picture that I took a number of years ago, where you see corn and squash, and further on there's, I don't remember what kind of plant, but it was all Kilayim together, all just mixed together in one field. On the left-hand side, you can even have bananas, which as we now know are halachically vegetables, mixed with some lettuce-like plant down there. This is not to be the halacha. So let's define our distances. And it makes a difference how much you're planting and in how big an area you are planting it. A field, a sadeh, is a plot that is wider than 6 meters and its length is greater than its width. So 6.1 meters by 6, that's going to be a field. A meshar is a plot of land that is between 60 and 6 meters wide, and it's longer than its width. So it's always going to be an irregular shape. It's never going to be a square. An individual plot can be a single plant or a row narrower than 60 centimeters. And that row can go to the horizon, but it will still be halachically considered a single individual plant. So what does this mean as far as distances between the different kinds of crops? Well, let's take a look. It depends if it's a grain and a legume or if it's a vegetable. Legumes are the peas, the beans. Grains are the grains. Chameshet minei dagan, only. Vegetables is anything else, but it has to be the fruit of the vegetable. We're not talking about something that you grow for the leaves. Rhubarb, which you do grow for the leaves, might be a slightly different situation, but we're talking about vegetables where you grow it for the root or you grow it for the fruit. So the distance between a field of grains and legumes and another field of different grains and legumes, you see the table here. And it is strange, it does not follow a coherent, I would say, or rational way, why a meshar, which is bigger than an individual row, can be closer to a field of a different kind of grain or legume compared to the individual one. Nobody knows. I've asked many rabbanim. I have not received a good answer. But with vegetables, and I would assume that most of the audience, if you're going to be planting something, most of you would not be planting grains in your garden, unlikely that you'll be planting legumes. You could be planting some vegetables, though. I recommend herbs, by the way. Don't bother with tomatoes. Tomatoes you can go down and buy at the market. It's going to be much cheaper to buy the tomato than to grow it. But if you do different herbs, you do parsley, you do kuzbara, if you're inclined to kuzbara, or dill, or even green onions, how far apart should you have those plants in your small vegetable garden? Well, vegetable by vegetable is different than grain and legume by vegetable. So if you look at the bottom table, you'll see that a field of vegetables, remember that's 6 meters by 6.1 meters minimum, and most of you do not have gardens that large. You have to keep it only 58 centimeters apart. That's barely a footpath. That's something like this. Not very much. And after that, 15 centimeters apart. And horticulturally, if you have your plants any closer than 15 centimeters, then you're not going to be growing well anyhow. Not lahalacha, and not as far as the produce itself is concerned. So it's really very simple to have a halachic vegetable garden at home. Just keep 15 centimeters between the shoots. In other words, from where it emerges from the ground. If it leans over and the carrot top touches the parsley plant, that's okay. But if the root of the carrot is not at least 15 centimeters from the root of the parsley, that's going to be Kilayim. So here is that Kilayim ruler in action. On the right is a carrot top, and on the left is a radish top. And as you can see, from shoot to shoot, they are 15 centimeters apart. Halachically, they are separated. The leaves themselves can touch. Nothing halachic will have gone wrong. Now, grafting of fruit trees is not directly mentioned in the Torah, and in fact, there's a discussion among archaeobotanists, archaeohorticulturalists. When did grafting begin at all in modern horticulture? Ancient horticulture was basically hunting and gathering. But when did grafting start? It started after we received the Torah. So the Mishnah in Kilayim says, in the case of trees, again, as we had with the vegetables, or the grains, now we're going to have it with the fruit trees, pears, P-A-I-R, pears, P-E-A-R, and wild pears together, quinces, chavush, and hawthorns. They are not considered mixed species with each other. You can graft one on the other. Apples and quinces, which are related to each other, peaches and almonds, which are closely related to each other, jujubes and other species of jujubes, it's hard to tell exactly what the Mishnah means, but we're very much related to each other. And it says in the Mishnah, even though they resemble each other, they are considered mixed species with each other. Not a little ink and some folds of parchment have been spilled on trying to explain this. It's not mentioned directly in Torah. It is Torah Sheba'al Peh, Halakha Moshe Misinai. It's not really easy to provide a scientific explanation for this. Religiously, this is the way it is observed. When you get into crosses between peaches and almonds, by the way, then the question is the resulting plant, is it a peach or is it an almond? And there are some halachically amusing stories about how the same thing can be judged to be a peach by one Rav and an almond by another Rav. Shmuel in Masechet Kedushin said, it says, my statute you should observe it, Toratai tishmoru. You shouldn't allow your animals to mate with each other. That's Kilayim. You shouldn't allow your seeds to be sown with each other. That's Kilayim also. So just as the prohibition against Kilayim applies to your livestock, so too is your field subject to these restrictions, both in Israel and outside of it. Surprise! A land-based mitzvah, a land of Israel-based mitzvah, just like Orla, is now also to be observed outside of Eretz Yisrael. Good thing we learned about those boundaries before. If you graft one tree onto another, says Rambam, like grafting an etrog onto a quince, or a quince onto an etrog, it violates the Torah prohibition everywhere, in Israel or in Chutz La'aretz. It also grafts common sense. I am not aware that it is possible to do that. It is possible that when the Rambam was talking about an etrog, that he was referring to something else, or that chavush meant something else. But it is not, as far as anybody I know, as far as I know myself, possible to get a viable graft like that. Or you graft a vegetable onto a tree, or a tree onto a vegetable, also not something that we are familiar with in reality. It violates the prohibition. And you cannot have a non-Jew graft a mixed species tree. Now that's something that we absolutely do have in reality. So it's forbidden for the Jew, but it's forbidden amira la'akum, for the Jew to tell the non-Jew, please do this, or even just say, do it. So at a hands-off basis, you still can't do it. On the left-hand side, you see a failed, it's not a brilliant picture, I apologize, but you see a failed pear tree graft. You see the pointy thing, that was the rootstock, but the graft itself, the thing with the V-shaped notch there on the right-hand side of that picture, it fell off. It didn't mate. It didn't mix. Why? Because they were insufficiently compatible. How so? Because they were not sufficiently closely related. This does happen. This is how you find out whether a certain rootstock is at all a potential commercial product. On the right-hand side, we have a marvelous picture of successful plum grafts, different varieties of plums, all grafted onto the same rootstock. Since they are all plums, it's permitted to do that, even though they look very, in fact, vastly different from each other. So on the right-hand side, we have reality. Plums come in different shapes, sizes, colors, flavors, textures. You can grow them all on one tree. On the left-hand side is a picture that I've seen way too often, and it is not based in reality or even on very good Photoshop. No, we have no bananas. Not with pear trees, not with citrus, not with kiwi fruit. No, they do not grow together. You cannot make a graft like this. Forget about it. What about a non-fruit tree graft? Actually, that's permitted if you can get them to actually mix together and make as one. These are pictures taken on the grounds of the Faculty of Agriculture in Rehovot, and these are actually using tree stumps more or less as pots, so they're not really a graft. These were dead trees. Somebody hollowed out the stump, planted another tree in it. It looks cute, but it isn't really what we're talking about as far as grafting goes. But here's something that we are talking about as grafting. The pomelit, which is a subset of grapefruit, is a very popular fruit. We used to export a lot of it, particularly to Japan, which for some reason could not grow it for itself. The question is, how do we grow it? And the answer is it doesn't grow well on its own rootstock, so they were grafting it onto different kinds of citrus rootstocks. And over a number of years, we tested alternatives. Why? Because the common rootstock was the sour orange, the chushchash. Now you see where the red arrow is, where there's the graft union. If you can see that line between the top is a pomelit, that's the scion. The bottom is the rootstock, that is the sour orange, the chushchash, and it's a beautiful tree. You can see a slight variation there as it transitions from the bottom part of the tree to the top, but it produces very nice fruit. The left-hand side is based on a citramelo, which by heredity, or genealogy, if you will, is part grapefruit. Oh, good, they're related to each other, much more closely related to each other than a grapefruit and an orange. So let's see if we can do. No, it turns out that even though they're related to each other, they don't make a good graft union. But you still have to test things like this. So we tested sour orange, we tested a grapefruit called marsh, we tested a citramelo, which is half grapefruit, and we tested something called the poor man's orange. It's actually called New Zealand poor man's orange. It's a great name because it's not from New Zealand, it's not for poor people, and it's not even an orange. Other than that, nomenclature, right on the spot. It is actually a form of wild grapefruit, and it turns out that both in conventional and organic farming, it produced more and better fruit than the conventional sour orange, which is Kilayim. So we have recommended this to people who want to observe that. It's a very minor example of how you can go and, in commercial horticulture, still observe the mitzvot, which was the point of the exercise. Not all genetic variation is engineered. I took this picture of cauliflower of different colors in a market in France, in Dijon, and you have different colors of cauliflower. For that matter, you can have different shapes of cauliflower, including some that grow as a pyramid. That's not engineered, that was just crossing and selecting. On the right-hand side, something with which almost all of us are familiar, apples and pears. They're the same fruit, and they come in different colors and different flavors and different textures. And they're all apples, and they can be grafted one to the other, the same way that plum tree that I showed you. So it's genetic variation, it's not engineered, it is natural. So let's sum up a little bit. The prohibition of Kilayim applies strictly, only, according to Rav Dov Lior. I should preface this. I am quoting Rav Dov Lior here. Rav Dov Lior has a very clear and more or less cogent method, I emphasize method, in his halachic decisions. I will confess that I am far from a fan of a lot of his political decisions, but in his view of halakha, he goes very straight. He says, the prohibition of Kilayim, when we're talking about genetic engineering, applies when you're intentionally interbreeding species in a natural and accepted manner. So, if you are trying to breed a sheep and a goat together, naturally, that's forbidden. He says that an appearance serves as the primary guideline for determining Kilayim. Genetic engineering doesn't create obvious signs of hybridization of species, which is true. If you look on the right-hand side, you will see a representation of a pig that was genetically engineered to produce milk that coagulates more easily for cheese production. Yes, pigs are mammals. Yes, pigs produce milk. Their milk is generally considered inferior. Thank God I have no idea personally how inferior it is. But if it has more of the enzyme that promotes coagulation and more rennet, then you can use that to prime cheese production, as in those wheels of cheese there. This is the museum in Holland, so they're all about pigs and they're all about cheese. And if they can combine the two of them, then that's not Kilayim either as far as they're concerned. But that, obviously we wouldn't use milk from a pig, but the pig looks like a pig. It doesn't look like a cow. It doesn't look like a sheep or any other animal from which we usually get the milk. Genetic engineering doesn't create obvious signs of hybridization. The Torah prohibits Kilayim, says Rav Lior, only in cases where mixing biological tissues capable of development and growth is involved. But actions aimed at enhancing quality or durability are not forbidden. So if you want to make something that really looks different and you're mixing two biological tissues, that's one thing. If you're taking some DNA, the halakha, in many cases, something that is invisible doesn't exist. This is where we get all these 1 part in 60, 1 part in 100, 1 part in 200. That means that it's invisible halachically. 1 part of DNA in an entire organism is absolutely invisible. So, he says that genetic engineering, as long as it doesn't produce something like a blue apple or a 7-legged goat, for whatever reason you wanted that, would be permissible. What defines a species anyway? You can look at how its shape, morphology. There are botanical paleontologists who look back to see what the fossil record says and how things developed over time, naturally. The ancient apple, by the way, when it says katapuach ba'atzei haya'ar, that probably wasn't an apple. Apples didn't come to this area until much after HaMelech Shlomo. Tapuach is probably something that swells up, tofeach. And it could be that it's referring to some kind of primitive or primordial citrus fruit, which goes from very small to relatively much bigger. Anyway, you can see in the fossil record what the species, how they diverged. You can look at the biochemistry, the biology, or the chemistry of the plant. Skip enzymology, though people don't look at that so much now, or molecular or genetic differences. La halakha, though, we look at the morphology. We don't look at the kishkis of the plant or the animal. We look at its externality. We look at how it is from the outside. Sometimes that gets confusing. The pasuk says, "Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'mitzrayim chinam." We remember the fish that we used to eat in Egypt for free. Chinam. They're emphasizing that. The melons and the cucumbers. What melons? What cucumbers? It says in Hebrew, "Et hakishuim ve'et avatichim." But a proper translation is melons and cucumbers. And even Bialik, in his translation of the Mishnah, kishuim, he translates as melana, which is Yiddish for melon. And avatichim, he translates as cucumber, which is indeed the cucumber. Because the former words, the former definitions of kishu and avatiach were respectively melon and cucumber. Nowadays, we think that a kishu is a squash or a zucchini for the Anglos. I can't remember how to say it in British. And a watermelon. That's not what they're talking about. So in Masechet Kilayim, when it talks about the squash and it uses the word avatiach, it doesn't mean watermelon, it means kishu. And they're not subject to the prohibition of mixed species. They are indeed related, I can tell you that botanically. And Rabbi Yehuda says that they are prohibited, but once again, as is so often the case, Rabbi Yehuda does not get to decide the final halakha. But that's why it says in Masechet Kilayim that you can plant squash and pumpkins in one furrow together. as long as one of them inclines to one side and one to the other. Now, botanically, they are closely related. Not intimately, but closely related. A squash, the soft squash, and the pumpkin, the harder orange on the inside, Hubbard squash, in one furrow together, no 15 centimeters between them. Well, it should be 15 centimeters, but you can go long with it, a long furrow. As long as one of them moves to one side and the plant moves to the other side, one vine leans here, the other one leans there. Everything that the sages forbade, it was only due to appearances, right? In other words, in this case, it's not what's inside that counts, certainly not genetically or molecularly. It is how it looks like on the outside, the externalities, mar'it ayin, as we say. So what's the bottom line on Kilayim? You may not create halachic Kilayim, as Rav Dov Lior pointed out. You don't want to cross animals that are distinctly unrelated to each other. You don't want to cross plants that are distinctly unrelated to each other. Incidentally, in both the case of the plants and the animals, it is so rare that a true interspecies cross or graft will take. But we have also halakha defining species based more on appearance than certainly on the genetics, and we must adhere to that halakha. We can benefit, though, from those. Somebody has made a mule, we can ride the mule. We can buy it, we can sell it. Somebody has made a cross or has grafted a peach onto an almond rootstock, we can eat those peaches. There's one exception. It says, Lo tizra karmacha kilayim, you cannot sow your vineyard with diverse seeds. That means any kind of annual plant. Trees you can plant next to it. Pen tikdash, and it's translated, lest the fruit of the seed which you have sown be forfeited. Now, be forfeited is not really what it means. And Chizkiah in Masechet Kiddushin says, pen tikdash, what's that mean? Pen tukad esh. And it's either you could be burned by fire. That's a pretty severe punishment for interspecies grafting or interspecies sowing. Rambam says, as a result, you'll have to distance yourself from the crops and forbid both of them. What's the solution? If between the rows of your grapevines, of your grape arbor, of your vineyard, you have sown wheat, let's say, because there's all that space there and the grapes aren't going to come out until after you've harvested the wheat, well, let's do that. If you have the wheat grain existing at the same time that there are grapes on the vine, that's kilayim. You have to choose which one to uproot. Most people will get rid of the wheat because it takes much less time to grow another crop of wheat somewhere than to go through the period of orla and grow and train a grapevine. But please note that I say that it has to be that both the fruit and the vegetable have to be present at the same time. Many people, many poskim, many kashrus authorities have to be machmir on this. Forbid any sowing in between the grapevines, even though the grapes aren't there yet. Because you don't know what if the grapevine starts bearing early, especially in a time of climate change, which is real, and things are coming out earlier. What are we going to do? Let's define a vineyard. Beit Shammai says if you have 5 grapevines in a row, that's a vineyard. Beit Hillel says it's not really a vineyard unless you have 2 rows there. They're actually being sort of machmir. For the purpose of Kilayim, Shammai is machmir, because he says that if you plant something within 2 meters, 4 amot, from the vines, Beit Shammai says it sanctifies pen tukad esh. You have to uproot either a 2-meter gap between what the annual plant that you have there, or you have to uproot the grapevines. You need that 2-meter gap. Beit Hillel says it sanctifies 2 rows. Here we are. Beit Hillel is being machmir again. And therefore, you keep the area between the vines and around the vines clear. As opposed to the case where you can have the carrot plant touching the radish plant from the top, but not from the stem. They should be that separated. If a vine overlaps a vegetable or a grain crop, an annual crop, that's forbidden. So either you can push the vine back into its row, or you can trim your wheat field, or you can not plant in a place where you know that you're going to have the vineyard expanding. Grapevines can grow as much as 3 meters in a season. They're pruned back severely every season. And many people, if they want to have a vegetable plot at the side, they are surprised to find that they suddenly have Kilei HaKerem. You can remove Kilei HaKerem by just pushing the vineyard aside. That's okay. You don't have to burn anything. On the other hand, you can, when Beit Hillel says, what does this 3 plus 2 thing mean? So further in the Mishnah, it says, planting 2 against 2 with 1 batin. If you look at the picture on the bottom left, that is also considered a vineyard according to Beit Hillel. The one on the right, however, where you have 2 and then an intervening single vine and then 2 more, is not a kerem. And Tom Smothers was Nifter Gavarin last week, and they famously sang a song called "The One on the Right is on the Left," and I just adapted it that the one in the middle is on the right, the guy in the rear, he's the one who makes it Kilayim, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. In most cases of Kilayim, we measure from where the plant emerges. I can't stress this enough. It's not overlapping. But with grapes, we don't. And I have to stress that as well. Uncertain cases of Orla and Kilei HaKerem are prohibited in the land of Israel, but permitted in the area called Syria, that uncertain land northwest of current Syria. It was only conquered by King David. So if there was an Orla vineyard and the grapes were sold outside of it, and there was a vegetable sown within the vineyard and the vegetable was sold separately from within the vineyard or from elsewhere, and you don't know, that's permitted in the lands conquered by David, and Kol Shekain in Chutz La'aretz altogether. Outside the land of Israel, even if you see the grapes from an Orla vineyard or vegetables from the vineyard, you can buy from them on the condition that you did not see the actual harvesting. Now, don't make yourself Einenu Lara'u, we didn't see this, but it is forbidden outside Eretz Yisrael, but the prohibition is not quite as strict. It is still forbidden, but there are certain leniencies. On the other hand, in the state of Israel, this is a very frum moshav, where the Thai workers had planted some very hot peppers, and the arrow in the left-hand picture on the right-hand side, and that's a grapevine there. Now, you can't do that, especially when the grapevine comes into leaf and overlaps with all kinds of interesting Thai vegetables. Forbidden. And let's go back to our friend the papaya. The papaya, by Ashkenazim, is a tree. Trees you can plant next to other trees. Not a problem. By Sfaradim, at least those who hold by the Sephardi Psak, it is considered a vegetable. So here we have a vineyard where there is a papaya tree growing next to a grapevine. Once that grapevine gets to overlap that papaya tree, and which will happen very soon, that's going to be forbidden. And you're going to have to either move the grapevine or uproot the papaya tree. The grapevine is where the money is, the papaya tree, not so much. Bottom lines. The Mishnah says, Kilayim of vineyards, prohibited from planting and tending and use. You can't eat it, you can't plant it, you can't tend it. Vegetables and grain crops, you can't plant them, but it's permissible for consumption. Garments, shatnez, permissible for all purposes. You just can't wear them. Animals, you can breed them, meaning you can maintain them within species, but you can't do crossbreeding. You can't, as I said, have horse date for donkeys. Mixtures of animals with each other are prohibited, but you can use them. Are you worried about Kilayim? In your garden, you could make a mechitza at least 40 centimeters tall. You can even do it lavud with strings like you do in the walls of your sukkah. No problem. Or 15 centimeters apart. In the market, there are no Kilayim in the Shivat Haminim. Okay, so the 5 tree fruits of the 7 total species. Nothing in dates, pomegranate, grape, fig, olive. No, sir. No genetically engineered crops are grown in Israel. Some are imported. I'm looking at you, soy schnitzel. Let the growers worry. It's incumbent on them. It's actually not the consumer's problem. It is mutar ba'achila. You can eat the produce of Kilayim, but you cannot cause it to be. Thank you for your attention so far, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we will talk about Shemitah, the 7th year, and as part of our mitzvot of the land in the state of Israel. Have a continued good evening.